Hello, a happy new year, and welcome back to Perspectives. On today's show, we look at how India's RSS has been found out trying to bypass the law to influence US politics and policy. Here in the UK, Sikh organisations lobby the government to change laws around hate marches to provide more protection for the community. Meanwhile, a call is sent out to Sikhs across the country to submit evidence as the Sikh National Inquiry into Muslim grooming gangs gathers apace. And in Canada, the Sikh Federation issue their new 2026 list of demands to Carney's government. And finally in the US, news comes in overnight of a small victory for Sikh truck drivers. Well, all this and more on today's show, and we'll wrap up as usual with a selection of your great comments at the end of the show, so do stay tuned for that. Right then, let's get underway. Sadly no James anymore, but it's just a one-man show, so do bear with me, but lots of stories to come. So let's take a look at the first story. Right, the RSS, once again in the news in the United States. There's been an interesting article that was written just around Christmas time by Harjit Singh that appeared in Baz News, and it's been covering a story that's been rumbling along for quite some time. We've certainly covered this whole idea, particularly in California, where even a Gurdwara in California is actually taking legal action against one well-known Hindutva organisation for, again, the same thing that this organisation you're about to hear about has been accused of being doing as well. The FARA, the Foreign Agencies Registration Act, being in breach of this. But this article, and I'll quickly go through it just to give you some highlights of what it's talking about. And again, it is great concern, particularly to the US Sikh community and actually the wider community in the United States, because this is a foreign power that is exerting influence over US policy and lawmaking, which really in any normal democratic country should not be allowed to happen, at least not with some form of accountability and oversight and some level of regulation. So, as Harjit Singh writes, when foreign influence efforts are ignored or dismissed by the US government, even as legal red lines are crossed, the consequences extend far beyond Washington. Indeed they do. Each failure of enforcement sets a dangerous precedent, telling autocratic governments and extremist movements worldwide that US transparency laws are negotiable. In other words, it's a very powerful point, this. It's saying if you let this happen and they get away with it, it means they feel, you know what, we can carry on doing this and we can successfully influence a foreign power's policy and lawmaking. And as he continues, the RSS has quietly begun lobbying. I'm interested about the word begun lobbying. I think this is an understatement. They've been at it for quite some time. But anyway, the RSS has begun lobbying members of Congress through a major DC firm, Washington DC firm, while avoiding the disclosures required under federal law. As it continues, now, according to public lobbying disclosures, the RSS has launched a well-funded lobbying effort in Washington. And as was first reported, a major US lobbying firm by the name of Squire Patton Boggs, SPB as we'll call it on here, registered earlier this year to lobby Congress on the RSS's behalf on issues it describes broadly as US-India bilateral relations. Now, of course, that does hide a whole host of sorts of things it could actually basically be lobbying about under this guise of, well, bilateral relations. It's a very euphemistic term that actually can cover some quite devious and insidious options. The government filings show that the firm received hundreds of thousands of dollars for this work, yet the registration did not identify the RSS as a foreign entity. Now, we do know that the RSS is massively resourced and funded by Hindutva forces as part of the Indian government and those behind the Indian government, particularly the Brahmanical ruling elite of India. And we've heard figures of up to $400 to $500 million a year being pumped into these sorts of lobbying forces overseas, both domestically and overseas. So it's a huge amount of money being poured, and that money, of course, carries a lot of weight and potential to influence foreign policy making and lawmaking. Government filings show that the firm received hundreds of thousands of dollars for this work. And don't forget, this is just one lobbying firm. But the registration did not identify the RSS as a foreign entity. So again, the RSS name has been left off this. So again, it's been very deliberately hidden. More alarming still, the firm didn't register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, the FARA, a law specifically designed to ensure transparency when foreign actors seek to influence American public policy. Yeah, absolutely. This law is in place for very good reason, to protect our democracy, protect US democratic rights. Again, if foreign governments and foreign agents, particularly agents acting on behalf of foreign governments, are trying to influence our governments, we need to know about it. They need to register the fact that they are doing this so that they can be seen and observed and about what they're up to. Now, this lack of registration matters. FARA requires much more detailed disclosure than the Lobbying Disclosure Act. That's a less stringent statute under which the firm chose to register. So again, it's a very deliberate act by this firm. It's registered under the Lobbying Disclosures Act, where it doesn't actually have to admit to the fact that it's acting on behalf of the RSS. Whereas it should actually have registered under the FARA, the FARA, where it would have had to highlight the fact that it is acting, lobbying on behalf of the RSS. Under US law, anyone acting in the US at the order, request, direction or control of a foreign principal must register under FARA if they engage in political or lobbying activities on that principal's behalf. This firm has not done that. So again, this is why it's become quite concerning. Now, SPB's role here, this is the company that should have registered under FARA, is also especially alarming in light of the firm's recent history representing other foreign clients implicated in grave human rights abuses. Until 2021, it served as a lead lobbying firm for a Saudi media entity linked to a senior Saudi official who was later sanctioned for his role in the brutal murder of the US-based journalist Jamal Khashoggi. If you remember that story, this is a Saudi dissident, effectively, a Saudi journalist who was murdered by the Saudi state. And this lobbying firm have actually acted on behalf of an individual connected to that. And it was only after sustained public pressure and after multiple members of Congress refused to meet with the firm because of that relationship did SPB terminate the contract. So again, it absolutely stinks. And then the article goes on, who is the RSS and why should Americans care? Well, we know in our audience, my regular audience, fortunately are fully aware of who the RSS are, what they're up to and why it matters certainly to the Sikh community. But what's important here, also equally important, is that the wider US community, all the communities in the United States need to understand why this matters. It matters because this is a foreign entity, a foreign power, and a very small part of that foreign power that ultimately controls an authoritarian regime that regularly abuses human rights in its home country is now lobbying your country to change its policies. So it's lobbying your country so it can also start abusing human rights without you even realizing it. It's very dangerous and it's very subtle. And then the article finishes off. Such an organisation now seeks legitimacy and access in the halls of the US Congress is deeply distressing, not only to Sikh Americans, but to all who value pluralism, human rights and democratic accountability. As I've just said, it matters to all of us. And this is what makes the RSS's quiet push into Washington so dangerous. Lobbying isn't merely about persuasion, it's about legitimacy, access and power. When an organisation with a documented history of sectarian extremism seeks to shape US policy behind closed doors, in other words, without any form of accountability or oversight or visibility, without full transparency, it undermines the democratic norms we claim to uphold at home and to promote abroad. So again, a very powerful piece there in Baz News. Thank you for that, Baz News. But it does highlight the fact, and again, as we highlight regularly on Perspectives, we must all in our democratic nations be fully aware of these lobbying organisations that are acting on behalf of foreign powers, particularly powers like India, and particularly the RSS Hindutva forces, this Brahmanical entity that is currently ruling India. They have sights and designs, particularly on the Sikh community, our Sikh communities right across the diaspora. They have already oppressed and persecuted and tried very hard to control them domestically in India, and particularly in the Punjab, but now they are trying to extend that control and that oppression and that persecution overseas. They're doing it both directly through transnational repression, and they are doing it indirectly, more subtly and arguably more dangerous, because it has a much more effective, wider blanket effect on our communities overseas through policies and lawmaking. It is trying to influence our own lawmakers and policymakers to then control and stamp down on the rights, the basic human rights of communities like the Sikh communities. So this is why we need to be very, very careful. Right, let's move on to my second story. Here in the UK, the Sikh Federation UK, again, we're talking about lobbying organisations. This is one very effective lobbying organisation here in the UK that does represent our community here in the UK. And they've done a huge amount of sterling work on behalf of our community here in the UK to raise all the issues that matter to particularly the British Sikh community, but not just the British Sikh community, it is actually the global Sikh community. Essentially, we're all fighting the same battles in essence and fighting the same common enemy. But here in the UK, the Sikh Federation UK have always been there at the forefront trying to highlight these big issues. Now, one of the big issues that has actually really directly affected much of our community is the issues of protesting, the right to protest, the rights. These are rights, again, that we take for granted in many cases. But quite often, and very often, fortunately, our Sikh communities are out there on the streets campaigning and protesting about many issues, not least the Khalistan issue, amongst many other issues. But of course, in a democratic nation like the United Kingdom or North America or down under, wherever you happen to be, we take for granted that we can take to the streets lawfully, legally, democratically, hold banners, shout out slogans. As long as we're not breaking any laws, we're not inciting violence, whatever, we can peacefully protest. Likewise, there is this ability that, again, we take for granted that anybody can counter-protest as long as, again, there is no incitement to violence, there is no restriction on each other's right to protest peacefully. However, unfortunately, as we've seen in recent times, these laws that we take for granted are now being exploited and abused by bad actors, by malign forces. And of course, particularly I'm referring to India here. Because quite often, as we've seen in the news, and we've reported here on Perspectives regularly, is that when our communities are out there protesting, whether it's for Khalistan or whether it's in support of Avtar Singh Kandar, etc., and all the big issues that matter to us, 1984 Operation Blue Star, etc., then quite often counter-protests magically appear. These counter-protests are usually in the form of Hindutva forces who've been deliberately pushed out there, obviously encouraged and enthused by Indian puppet masters to get out there and to deliberately try to disrupt legitimate democratic protests or campaigning by Sikh communities here in the UK. This has caused problems because they are deliberately provoking, deliberately trying to incite violence, deliberately trying to close down and silence legitimate democratic protests. So as a result of this, the Sikh Federation is lobbying our government now to say, look, you need to take attention to this. Pay attention to what's going on, because likewise, again, as we just talked about in the United States, there are malign forces that come from outside the United Kingdom that are trying to disrupt our normal democratic flow, our normal democratic rights to protest, to raise public awareness of issues that matter very much to us. So what the Sikh Federation UK has done, they have submitted detailed evidence to the UK, the Home Office Independent Review of Public Order and Hate Crime Legislation. Now, the review is being led by Lord MacDonald, and he's recently announced this initiative by the government that followed concerns around recent protests. It's examining police powers to manage protests and hate crime laws, including stirring up hatred, aggravated behaviour and online hate, because of course this then extends onto the online platforms. The Federation calls for the law to be strengthened and police practices to be changed for what the Sikh Federation UK has termed hate protests. This includes right-wing protests and other protests using inflammatory language to intimidate particular communities. So again, refer back to what I was just been talking about. Now, the other main area where the Federation has asked the law to be strengthened is around counter-protests that are sponsored or supported by foreign governments. These are designed to intimidate or incite peaceful protesters in Britain, exercising their right to freedom of expression, and criticise the policies and actions of foreign governments. And then it continues. Attention is being drawn to highlight the police failing to take action when hate crimes have been committed by counter-protesters directly linked to the Indian High Commission when they've been formally reported to the police. For example, at one counter-protest, they held placards with images of the Sikh turban and shouted offensive slogans. So in addition, details have been submitted to the Indian authorities using transnational oppression to identify and target Sikh protesters in London and their families in Punjab. Again, we come back to this deeply cowardly act of India targeting families back in the Punjab for actions taken here in the UK by perfectly legitimate protesting by our Sikh community. This includes details of a named British Sikh man from West London who's not been allowed to return to Britain for 2 years as he awaits trial for taking part in a protest outside the Indian High Commission in London in March 2023. Again, this is absolutely shocking abuse of any normal process of democratic law. And again, we only have to refer to Avtar Singh Kandar, who was actually legitimately protesting outside the Indian High Commission in London. And the price he paid for that, of course, was potentially, as it turns out, probably being murdered by the Indian state. So again, all part of this transnational oppression. Well, there are many issues that are being brought out by this whole story, but ultimately, it is the right, as I said, we have the right to protest peacefully. Now, what we are seeing, and this actually isn't just restricted to the Sikh community, what we are seeing, for example, is even when the right wing take out to the streets in protest, there's actually been accusations that counter-protests have been deliberately allowed, not just allowed, but actually encouraged and assisted by the state, by the police, to then go and oppose the existing protests. So when right-wing protests have been out there on the streets legitimately protesting about what they care about, is that the British state, including the police, have been seen to have been encouraging and insisting left-wing extremists to then join in the same geographical locality to then launch a counter-protest and then deliberately to try and incite violence, to incite law-breaking effectively. And these things then descend into violence, which then, of course, the mainstream media are always actively encouraged to report their agenda, their particular narrative, to try and paint, well, in this case, it's particularly the right wing, as the evil perpetrators of violence, when in fact much of the violence is coming from the opposite side, these deliberately created counter-protests. So again, you can see how our democratic processes of demonstration and this ability to demonstrate peacefully and democratically is being undermined, it's being abused, and it's being exploited by bad actors, by bad forces, whether it's the extreme left, whether it is the extreme right, and indeed whether it is from India, from alternative nations that are trying to influence our own domestic policy and our own domestic agenda. This is what we need to be very, very aware of and very careful about. The Sikh Federation particularly are fighting this battle. Always, once again, it is the Sikh community that is at the forefront of many of these issues that do affect directly the Sikh community, but they have a wider context, they have a wider impact on all of us, all communities, whether it is indeed the Islamic community, the Buddhist or the Hindu community. We're all affected by this. And indeed, the white communities, even the right wing, we're all affected by these bad actors who are destroying, they are undermining our basic rights to protest, which are a normal, fundamental part, a pillar of living in a democratic nation. You don't see this in India, for example. You can't democratically protest in the same way that you can here in the UK about anything. In the UK, you can literally protest and demonstrate about just about anything, as long as it obviously doesn't break any laws or incite violence. But ultimately, you can protest. I can protest. I demand every house in the United Kingdom is painted pink. I mean, as ridiculous as it sounds, but I have that right to do that. I can do that legitimately. But there are things in India, for example, that I certainly couldn't. I can't walk down the street with a placard saying, "Long live Khalistan, I promote Khalistan." I can't walk down the street in Delhi and do that. I would disappear into the back of a van and be tortured for several days and then probably never to be seen again. That is that is basically what we face in India. We do not want that same here in the West, in the democratic West. We do not want to sink into that sort of oppressive regime that India is experiencing, but that is the way it's going. We need to be very careful. Thank you to the Sikh community for highlighting this once again. And then Dabinderjit Singh, who is the lead exec for political engagement at the Sikh Federation, he did make a statement at the end of this press release, and he did say, "We have put forward radical proposals for tackling hate protests and the need to outlaw counter-protests sponsored by foreign powers." And again, you can see how this mirrors what we've been talking about in the United States. "We will be following up our submission with members of the review team and Lord MacDonald to expand on our suggestions to prevent disorder and protect the right to peaceful protest in Britain." Hear, hear, well said, Dabinderjit. subject. It's a very, very important subject, this. And again, all you out there in the diaspora, we must all fight this as one. We must all unite to fight this erosion of our democratic rights to protest. And again, always highlight the malign influences coming from overseas, not just domestically. Of course, there are enough bad actors domestically, but overseas as well. We must highlight that. Okay, let's move on to the next one. This is a quick one. Now, of course, we have, staying in the United Kingdom, the Grooming Inquiry. The rape and grooming gangs, this is a subject that we've covered quite regularly here on Perspectives. We have had this story that has been going on for decades. And it's a horrible situation where young girls, and particularly in the Sikh community, and this happened all the way back to the 1970s, is that young girls, underage girls, our daughters, have been targeted by Islamic grooming gangs, particularly gangs from the Islamic community. And of course, we're not painting the whole Islamic community with this. It is just a small number of men in the Islamic community who have been very deliberately targeting young girls, particularly in the Sikh community in the old days, but has now spread into the white community as well and other ethnic communities, is that young girls are being targeted and exploited for sex crimes and for rapes. It's an absolute outrage that has been going on for decades. It is an outrage that has been deliberately buried and covered up by our own government. And again, it is just unbelievable that I have to say these words, that even our own Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is guilty of, it appears, trying to cover up and hide the truth of what's been going on. There have been accusations that Keir Starmer himself, our Prime Minister, was the Director of Public Prosecutions. It was his individual responsibility alone to pursue these rape grooming gangs in past years when he was in charge of this sort of this legal responsibility to pursue this, to investigate and to bring charges against these grooming gangs. It was brought to his attention by the Sikh community, because once again it was the Sikh community at the forefront, because originally it was the Sikh girls that were being targeted. So Sikh girls were being targeted. As a result, the Sikh community got together, went to the British state and said, look, what's happening to our young girls? They are being targeted by these grooming gangs. Will you please investigate and enact the law? Do something about it. They were ignored. The British government, the British police ignored the cries for help from our Sikh community. In charge of that was the Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer, who is now our Prime Minister. Now, there have been calls over the last year or more to launch this inquiry. Ever since the Labour government got into power and Starmer became our Prime Minister, is that the whole British public have said you need to launch an inquiry into these grooming gangs, because our young girls, now it's not just young Sikh girls, the fact now it's white girls, suddenly white people have seemed to now paid attention to the fact that it's been happening. They didn't believe it before because it was only happening to the Sikh community, but now it's happening to white girls as well. Suddenly everybody's magically woken up. But ultimately, so as a result, people are clamouring by their millions to say you've got to investigate this. Keir Starmer is sitting on it. He said, yes, okay, eventually, after so much pressure, he finally said, okay, we'll launch an inquiry. But again, we are a year into this process. We've had somebody who was appointed to chair this inquiry, then resigned. We've had many of the witnesses, the key witnesses, victims, who were then brought into the committee to help launch this inquiry, who've resigned, saying it's going to be a whitewash. We're already seeing that they are trying to already bury the truth. They're trying to protect those who were behind this. They are particularly trying to protect the politicians whose responsibility it was in the time to investigate it, and now are complicit in these sorts of crimes. They are trying to protect them as well. So again, they are protecting the guilty. How familiar this story is. Again, it's reflective of India, this sort of level of justice. But Keir Starmer is holding back. He is deliberately delaying these inquiries. Fortunately, the Sikh community once again are at the sharp end, once again forming the pressure group to launch an inquiry. Essentially, they're having to launch their own justice into this. So well done to Sikh Youth UK. Deepa Singh particularly, who's been hugely active, hugely positive in rallying and lobbying the community, the Sikh community, to assist the white community as well, who also have their own organisations looking into this. There are many from the wider communities who are now helping to form these unions, these alliances, to actually launch, essentially, it's almost like an independent inquiry, because we've given up on the government's efforts. The government clearly are too afraid to launch their own inquiry because they're too afraid of what they might uncover and who actually might be guilty of this and who actually bears some responsibility, Keir Starmer. So ultimately, it's fallen to the Sikh community in alliance with many other organisations to push forward inquiries to investigate who is behind this, who is guilty, what is being going on, and particularly who has been guilty of trying to cover this up. So anyway, that was a large intro to give a lot of context to maybe our overseas audience who are not fully aware of what's been going on here in the UK. Now, Sikh Youth UK have reissued this call for submissions for their own rape and grooming national inquiry, which will be collated as evidence for the expected 2026 UK government independent grooming inquiry. So ultimately, it has fallen again back to the Sikh community, particularly Sikh Youth UK, to collect evidence that they can then package up and present to the government inquiry and say, here is all the evidence, what are you going to do about it? You can't bury it now because we have found all the evidence, we've basically handed it all to you on a silver plate. Now it is your responsibility as a government to do something about it. You let us down and God help you. That's the message from the Sikh Youth UK organisation. Well done to them. Well done to Deepa Singh as always. And please do, particularly here in the UK, if you know anybody who has been affected by this in any way, shape or form, even indirectly, please get in touch with this inquiry. Please go on their website, Sikh Youth UK. You can Google it, you can find it very easily. Have a look at it. Please, there are submission forms to enter. If you've been affected by it, please send in your evidence. It doesn't matter how indirectly or how small you feel it is. Every piece of evidence matters because it helps paint a bigger picture. It helps paint the picture that creates the whole case. Law can only be enforced if they have evidence. They need that evidence. Please help the community put that evidence together so we can present it to the government so that they will be forced to do something about it. So there you go. Well done to Deepa Singh on that one. And let's move across to Canada. And the Canadian, I talk about Sikhs, the Sikh community, always leading the vanguard in terms of lobbying governments about issues that particularly affect obviously the Sikh community, but of course then have a wider impact on the wider democratic communities. In Canada, the 2026 Sikh Advocacy Mandate has been published. Now this is an annual publication that the community in Canada always produces, and again, it's very much like here in the UK. The Sikh community produce their manifesto. They call it the Sikh Manifesto. Every I think it's every 3 or 4 years they produce that, which again is a document that summates, that puts into summary, backed up by evidence and detail, etc., of all the issues that matter to our Sikh communities. And it is these documents that form the basis, the infrastructure, that then all the lobbying efforts can then be pushed forward to our politicians, to our democratic representatives, who in turn can then start to influence and affect law and policy making in our nations. So in Canada, the Sikh Federation in Canada have done effectively the same thing. They've put this 2026 Sikh Advocacy Mandate, which is designed to essentially put together in one formal document all the issues that matter to the Sikh community in Canada. And it's been hugely resourced. It's not just something that's been cobbled together very quickly. It is as it describes, it is a robust community-led data effort that took place over last year that involved a huge, extensive consultative process with Sikhs across Canada, engaged Gurdwara leadership, community organisations and nearly 2,000 grassroots survey respondents on urgent political, human rights and legislative issues. The results were clear and demonstrated unified priorities across geographic and demographic lines on 5 core areas. So what are those core areas that really matter to Sikhs in Canada? Well, quickly to go through them, I'll just highlight these key issues and recommendations, and this basically summarises actually what follows in the following pages, and it falls into these 5 areas: ensuring inclusivity and protecting multiculturalism. That is obviously things like combating anti-Sikh hate, protecting civil liberties and religious freedoms, confronting groups that advocate hate. We all know where they came from. Likewise, rebuilding public trust and transparency. This, of course, includes many things like public inquiries into foreign interference. And we had that Foreign Interference Commission that was recently completed in Canada, which we reported on extensively. To continue the study on Indian interference specifically and criminal activities within Canada, and community dialogue and legislative reform. Next section includes combating foreign interference, transnational oppression. Again, we don't need to sort of go into too much detail about that. We all know what that's all about. Ensuring justice and meaningful charter protections. Now, this is a very particular area. It specifically refers to reforming Canada's Extradition Act and immediately stop the criminalisation of Sikh activists in Canada. That's a really important one because, again, under pressure from India, we see, and again we report on it regularly, how India has been pressuring for years, decades even, to try and force the Canadian authorities to label Khalistani campaigners as terrorists. They've tried from every possible angle to try and criminalise Khalistan campaigning. Fortunately, they've failed. But again, the battle and the war is not won. Again, we need to continue to lobby the Canadian government, unfortunately, who seem to be caving in more recently to pressure from India. But we need to keep the pressure up on the Canadian government to ensure that we do not criminalise campaigning, legitimate, lawful, democratic campaigning for Khalistan. And then finally, principled foreign policy, ensuring that justice and accountability prevail, recognising genocide, of course, the 1984 genocide in November 1984, and ensuring Canada's international relations, further human rights, democratic values, and the rules-based world order. Let's spread our democratic values around the world, but particularly we need to remind India that it seems to have forgotten its democratic credentials. And then the report actually finalises with a summary saying it addresses realities with concrete policy recommendations, which are the establishment of dedicated funding to combat anti-Sikh hate, launching of an independent public inquiry into Indian activity in Canada, protection for political dissidents facing credible threats, reforming legislation to ensure meaningful charter protections, and finally, ensuring Canada's foreign policy reflects its stated commitment to human rights. Yes, indeed. How sadly we've had to report that Canada seems to have forgotten its policy that it is supposed to stand up for human rights when we see Mark Carney shaking hands with Narendra Modi. Sad to say that has happened in recent times. And then finally, a bit of good news from California. I'm delighted to report. Yesterday, in Perspectives, we did say, and I did a particular piece on how we had this ridiculous administrative bureaucratic situation where Sikh truck drivers in the United States are finding that their commercial driver's licenses are being rescinded. Potentially, it was going to happen in January, about in the next few days. They were going to be rescinded by the US government if their visas happened to expire, their visas to stay and work in the United States, if they expired before the expiry of the CDL. We had this ridiculous situation that Sikh truck drivers were losing their licenses because their permits to live and work in the United States happened to expire before the expiry of their CDLs, which was a stupid situation. Anyway, fortunately, as of yesterday, the California Department of Motor Vehicles has agreed to provide interim relief by delaying this cancellation up until March. So roughly 20,000 drivers received notices in November and December that their CDLs would be cancelled early in 2026. Now, the organisation has extended the timeline to March the 6th for about 17,000 drivers whose licences were set to terminate on January the 5th. That's in about 4 days' time. So that is a little bit of good news. Now, we're not out of the woods yet, unfortunately, but what it does mean is that we still have 3 months of lobbying time for all the organisations. And don't forget, as we reported yesterday, the Sikh Coalition, along with alliances across the United States, are lobbying and taking legal action. They are launching a class action lawsuit against, I think it's against the Californian state, but ultimately it's against the US administration, ultimately, to change this, to change the regulations, to say you cannot do this, it is unlawful, you cannot attack truck drivers, you cannot remove their CDLs under these regulations, it is unlawful. So fingers crossed that legislation will work, but of course we've now just won at least 3 months' time. We've won some breathing space that is going to allow time for the law to take effect, for those in the community to continue their lawful attacks on the US administration, essentially their defence to try and overturn these regulations, to let's hopefully see common sense prevail, and that this silly bureaucratic loophole we seem to have ended up in is rescinded, is overturned, and that these vital truck drivers, don't forget how important these truck drivers are, that these vital truck drivers retain their CDLs, because ultimately it is the United States supply chain that is at risk here. It is a massive act of self-harm, this. The phrase I used yesterday was they are using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And all it is a massive act of self-harm in the US by the US government. Please don't do it. Please think again. So there we go. And those are the news stories for the day. Let us move on to now our comments section. Thank you again, as always, to our wonderful audience. Thank you to all of you who contributed in the comments section. Please do keep them coming in for future shows. I know it's only me now. It is a sad loss to lose James, but hopefully James will be back in the future. But ultimately, I do appreciate your comments. And of course, I do read your comments every day and really appreciate and have a laugh at many of them, and feel particularly poignant about many others that do come in. And of course, many of you have been both emailing and messaging about certain situations that we've had to research and look at as potential news stories. Some of them very quite shocking, very interesting. So do keep those coming in as well. And thank you to all of you who have contributed. So we'll start off today with, and this is after yesterday's show, the perspectives, where, oh good heavens, we reported on this ridiculous situation in New Zealand, the Naga Kirtan in Auckland, that met this bunch of absolute idiots. I'm sorry to say, but these guys were a complete and utter bunch of idiots. And these right-wing Christian extremists, there's no other way to describe them other than idiots. Now, R.M. Newton, thank you for your comment. It was actually in Punjabi. I had to translate this. So apologies if this is not fully translated correctly. I believe it is, so it does make sense. And R.M. Newton says, in New Zealand, the Naga Kirtan was done with the permission of the administration. They also deployed police. The whole thing was actually a proper organised procession. There was nothing illegal, nothing wrong with this procession. It had the support of the local police. It was organised by the local Gurdwara. It was supported by the police, so there's nothing wrong with it. Don't forget, Sikhs are also citizens of New Zealand. They have the same rights as anybody in New Zealand, particularly the European immigrants. And this is the key point that I raised yesterday, all the Europeans are immigrants there. It's not just the Sikhs, but those protesters, those idiot white protesters who were doing the haka, which is nothing to do with white people. That is an indigenous dance of the Maori people. So the white people were doing a haka, but these white people are also immigrants. So when you're saying our New Zealand, it's just as much your New Zealand as it is the Sikhs. Again, anyway, I'm going to start ranting again because these people were just a joke. Also, the Christian group that was opposing it are also immigrants here. They don't have any more rights than the Punjabi citizens. Exactly. Well said, R.M. Newton. It's also worth noting that New Zealand this is an important point. New Zealand's a secular country. It's not a Christian country. It's a secular country. So when these idiots come and chanting, Jesus Christ is the one true God, or whatever it is that they were chanting, well, fine, that is your democratic right, but you have no right to then start attacking the Sikhs who were peacefully processing their Naga Kirtan. So again, don't forget, you have no more right to practice your Christian values than any other Muslims, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, of course. We can all practice our religions in New Zealand. We have an equal right, because ultimately the New Zealand constitution, I actually don't know if it has a written constitution or not. Maybe, I know we do have some viewers in New Zealand. Let me know. Do you have a written constitution? But anyway, ultimately, constitutionally, written or otherwise, New Zealand is a secular nation. It speaks for itself. Also note that the opposing group opposes all non-Christian immigrants, not just Sikhs. In other words, they're not representatives of the general Christian people. They're only a small group. They are, yeah, absolutely. Thank you, R.M. Newton, for painting a common sense comment. These people are just a small fringe of extremists. No, they're idiots. And they weren't just attacking Sikhs. They were attacking everybody in New Zealand. Absolutely. And they need to be put back in their box and the lid put back on it and just patted down so that just shut up and go away, you know. You have a right to peacefully demonstrate and protest, but don't interfere in other people's peaceful demonstrations or practicing their religious beliefs. So well said, R.M. Newton. A huge dose of common sense there. Thank you for that. Hello, Timbuktu. Love the title. It's so true. Yes, indeed. Is this a joke? And I have to say, when I put that thumbnail together, it just immediately came, is this a joke? Because I was laughing. I'm laughing now because it was so ridiculous seeing these white folk doing the hacker, trying to sort of have a go at the Sikhs. It was pathetically embarrassing. I have to say, I'm ashamed as a white person to look at these guys, to see what they were doing. It was risible. It was pathetic. So yes, is this a joke? It is, absolutely. It was almost like a joke. As I say, it would be funny if it wasn't true. Hardal Singh, idiots. Yeah, well, there you go. Hardal. Well said, Hardal. You've used the right word. Idiots. A far-right cult group. Actually, yes, that's the right word. Cult. That is a good word to use. Disrupting a peaceful Sikh parade. Thanks to Sikhs for being firm and no retaliation. Of course, well done. And gosh, how often do I have to say to our Sikh people in our audience, when you go out there protesting, democratically, peacefully protesting, please do not get provoked. It is so important. Never, ever get provoked. I know it's so easy to say that. But when, and sadly, we have had to report where, unfortunately, Sikhs have been provoked. They've just lost control because they've been provoked deliberately, usually by Hindutva. Whenever you're out there, don't full temptation, because quite often these counter protests, refer back to my Sikh Federation story, they are deliberately designed to provoke you. They are designed to provoke a reaction so that everything's filmed these days. They've all got their mobile phones, so they will cut out the provocation. They will film you acting violently. It doesn't matter if it's in self-defense. They film you acting violently. It goes viral, and suddenly your campaign, your peaceful decent protest or campaign is smeared. It is negatively tainted because sadly you fell to this provocation. So again, I always say, please never ever get provoked. Try not to retaliate. Keep it peaceful. Well done to the Naga Curtain for keeping it peaceful. The shouts of Bole Sonehal, it brought goosebumps out into the arm actually. This peaceful, they stood their ground, they shouted Bole Sonehal. And as I said yesterday, if I was in the white thing and I saw several hundred Sikhs shouting Bole Sonehal, I think I'd be running very fast in the other direction. So well done to them. Well done to all you guys in New Zealand. Well done to that. Now, we had a load of comments, as indeed we have actually over yesterday's show. A lot of comments after James departed. Sad, if James, you're watching, we miss you already. And loads of comments have poured in support. Amrit Saravar, it is sad to see you go, James. We wish you very good luck indeed. We all do from Satellite. Good luck, James. Gurpreet, one of our regulars again. Your presence will be missed on the show. We will see you again, indeed. And we will make sure we do get James back. Thank you for all the great work you've done and wish you all the best. Avatar Dylan, likewise. Nice one, Angus and James. Sorry to hear James leaving. Probably doing something else. Yes, I know he's keeping busy. Have a great new year to both you and your families, and likewise to all our audience. A happy new year to you all. And Kay Singh, interesting in this one. Try the following book, The Political Science of the Sikh Religion. It's a PDF. It's free. It's obviously quite long, 878 pages. Hardcore, real Sikhi in khalistan. I haven't had the time to myself, but I will try and look at that out for myself as well. I think that should be maybe essential reading for all of us non-Sikhs, just to understand fully what the Sikh religion is all about, and the political science behind it. Because actually, again, that's a very important point. Politics, spirituality are inextricably linked within Sikhi. Again, this is what makes Sikhi so powerful on the global stage. And then final set, Sequence saying, thank you, Angus and James. I always await for your programme. Well, we always await for your comments as well. Thank you for your support. Do keep the comments coming in. Gurmohan Greywal, Merry Christmas to your family and friends and all your viewers. Same from Samsung. Happy holidays. Thanks for your service. Really appreciated. Well, again, I always turn it back to you guys. Thank you for your support, your loyalty, your comments. We couldn't do it without you. Gurpreet is back again. Welcome back, both of you. Hope you had a good Christmas and Happy New Year. Welcome back, gentlemen from TC. All our regulars are out there as well. Thank you for all the best wishes. It is this happy Satledge family, which includes obviously you guys out there, particularly our regulars. Thank you for being there on a daily basis. You all know who you are. You always contribute, all of you, so regularly in the comments columns. They are so much appreciated. It gives me such a warm, fuzzy feeling when I look at the comments after each of our shows and I see all of you, particularly the regulars who are there almost on a daily basis, always taking the effort to make comments. It is very much appreciated. But particularly also to those newcomers who just dip in. And I do know there are many regulars who do actually watch the show but never comment. It doesn't matter, you don't have to. But even if you just put in a little Sat Sri Akal emoji, whatever, it all counts. At least we know you're there. We know you're watching, and I do appreciate that. And the final sign-off goes to Kirpals and Sukha Singh, who both say, well, Khalistan Zindabad and Raj Karega Khalsa, the Khalsa will return. Indeed it shall. Khalistan will return in the form of the new empire, the new democratic empire for the Sikh community. The Khalsa will come back, and we look forward to that very day. But on that note, we shall bring the show to a close. Thank you to all of you who have contributed. As I say, we're missing James, but it's a one-man show, and I can only continue if you guys are still there watching and supporting me, and of course the full team here at Satledge. But we have a podcast coming up tomorrow as well. Do watch, keep an eye out for that with Dr. Sandhu. But in the meantime, keep your comments coming. Thanks so much for watching. Do, of course, I want to express a huge happy Christmas on behalf of, well, the Christian community, to our Sikh fellow human beings. But a happy holidays to you all. But most particularly, a very happy, a very healthy and a very prosperous new year to each and every one of you and your families. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being there. It really is appreciated, particularly from me personally. And all being well, I will see you for the podcast for tomorrow, but likewise back with Perspectives on Monday morning. Thanks so much for watching. It is a goodbye from me, and that's it for another day. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you next time.